The dust rises before anything else. It spirals upward in thick, amber columns under a Nevada sky, so white with heat, it looks like the sun has given up trying to be a star and decided instead to become the whole atmosphere. The fence posts cast no shadow. There is no wind. Inside a high-walled arena reinforced with double-welded steel rails, something enormous moves. Not trots, not circles. Moves. The way a storm front moves, with weight and intention and the absolute promise of consequence. Outlaw. 16 hands of black muscle, scar-cross-hatched flanks, and eyes the color of old blood. 3 professional riders had climbed onto his back. 2 walked away with broken vertebrae. 1 did not walk away at all. Kiara stood on the outside of the fence, 1 boot on the lowest rail, her hands loose at her sides. She was 31 years old, 8 weeks a widow, and looking at the only thing standing between her and losing everything her husband had died on top of. The horse turned, fixed her with those dark eyes. She did not look away. When Kiara inherited her husband's broken ranch, she had no idea that saving it meant taming the horse that had destroyed every rider who ever tried. But when she looked into that animal's eyes, she discovered something that turned her grief into fury. Outlaw hadn't been trying to kill anyone. He had been trying to warn her about the man who murdered her husband. Before we go any further, I need you to think about something. This story is about a woman who walked into a pen with an animal that had already put men in the hospital, and she walked in without a weapon, without a rope, and without fear. Not because she was reckless, because she understood something most people never learn. Sometimes the most dangerous creature in the room is not the one with the loudest roar. Here is what I want to know from you. Have you ever had a moment when everyone told you something was impossible? A situation, a relationship, a chance, and you chose to walk toward it anyway? Drop your city and your answer in the comments. Like this video if you believe trust can survive even the worst kind of betrayal. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because we are just getting started. Now, let us go back to Nevada. Let us go back to the dust. The accident report said the tractor rolled on the eastern slope of the Black Ridge property at approximately 11:40 on a Tuesday night in late August. Daniel Voss, age 34, was found beneath the machine by his own ranch hand at first light. The cause was listed as operator error on a grade. The investigation took 4 days. It was closed on a Friday. Kiara had not been sleeping well since the funeral. She sat now in the kitchen of the main house, a low, wide structure that Daniel's grandfather had built from local stone and stubbornness, and she stared at the papers Sexton had laid across the table without ceremony. Gerald Sexton was 62, the kind of lawyer who wore the same suit to court as he wore to funerals, and he had the practiced stillness of a man who delivered bad news for a living. The mortgage balance was $219,000. The bank's notice of intent to foreclose was dated 3 weeks prior. They had 90 days from that date. Kiara turned the paper over, as though the back of it might say something different. It did not. Gerald folded his hands. He told her that Daniel had taken out a second lien 18 months ago. Equipment costs, a drought season, the vet bills for the breeding stock. He had not told Kiara the full amount. Gerald believed he had been planning to resolve it before she found out. She did not cry. She had run out of that particular resource somewhere around the second week of the 7-day visitation period that ranch country observed with grim fidelity. She asked what her options were. Gerald listed them with the efficiency of a man who had already thought through the problem during the 90-minute drive from Reno. She could sell the property. Brantley Walsh had already approached Gerald's office with an offer, $110,000, cash, fast close. It was less than half what the land was worth even in a down market. Or, and here Gerald paused in a way that carried some weight, she could enter the Nevada State Working Ranch Championship. Prize money was $100,000. Entry required a working horse from the owner's property, demonstrable ranch skills, and 30 days to qualify. The championship was 41 days away. Kiara looked out the window. The eastern slope was visible from here. She could see the faint scar in the grass where the tractor had come to rest. She asked about Outlaw. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He told her the horse had been part of the property for 2 years. Daniel had acquired him through a livestock auction in Elko under circumstances that Gerald did not fully understand. Outlaw had a documented history: 3 riders, 3 injuries, 1 fatality involving a contractor who had ignored explicit warnings. He had been isolated in the reinforced bay at the south end of the stable since the last incident 14 months ago. No one went near him. As if summoned by the name, a sound rolled in from outside. Not a whinny, not a scream exactly, but something between those two things. The walls of the kitchen absorbed it. Gerald said that Brantley Walsh had been calling the horse a liability, a damaged animal that would bring the whole insurance situation down on her head. He strongly recommended she consider the sale. The door opened then, and Brantley Walsh himself stepped through it without knocking. He was a wide man in his mid-50s, the kind of wide that comes from comfort rather than labor, and he wore a pressed western shirt with pearl snaps as though he were going somewhere important. He smiled at Kiara in the way that men smile when they believe they are being generous. He said he was sorry for her loss. He said it the way people say things they have already moved past. He told her he could have a check in her hand by Monday. He said he would even take the problem horse off her hands as part of the deal, save her the disposal costs. Kiara looked at him over the kitchen table, and something shifted in her expression. Not anger, not grief. Something colder and more patient than either of those. She told him she would think about it. Brantley smiled again and left. Gerald watched the door close and then looked at Kiara with an expression that was equal parts admiration and concern. She told him she was going to enter the championship. He asked her with what horse. She did not answer. She stood, put on her barn jacket, and walked out into the heat toward the reinforced bay at the south end of the stable. Gerald watched her through the kitchen window until she disappeared behind the fence line, and then he sat alone at that table and did not move for a long time. She brought a lawn chair. That was the first thing. Not a rope, not a halter, not a crop. A folding aluminum chair with a faded canvas seat that had been sitting in the tack room for years, and she carried it to the outside of Outlaw's reinforced bay and set it down facing the gate and sat in it. The horse was at the far end of the enclosure. He had heard her coming. His ears had tracked her before she rounded the corner, and he stood now with his body turned sideways, which she recognized from her years of working with trauma patients as the body language of something that wants to monitor a threat without appearing to engage with it. Diagonal observation. Controlled distance. The behavior of an animal that had learned that direct confrontation cost too much. She opened the book she had brought. She read aloud. Not to him. Not performatively. She simply read at a conversational volume, letting the sound of her voice exist in the air between them as a fact rather than a demand. She had chosen a field guide to high desert ecosystems because it was the only book in the house that held no emotional charge for her. She did not want her voice to carry grief. She read about sagebrush root structures and the water retention patterns of alkaline soil, and her voice was steady and unhurried, and it asked nothing of the animal 12 feet away from her. He moved once in the first hour. He shifted his weight from his left hind to his right, and his ears swiveled briefly toward her, and then he looked away. She took that as progress. She came back the next day, and the day after. She brought different books, a history of the Humboldt River watershed, a hardware store catalog, a collection of John Muir's journals that she found in Daniel's desk. She varied the rhythm of her reading, sometimes slower, sometimes faster, because she wanted him to learn that her voice had range without being a threat. She had spent 6 years as a physical rehabilitation specialist working with trauma patients before she moved to the ranch with Daniel, and she understood that the nervous system of any creature that has been repeatedly hurt does not respond to kindness at first. It responds to consistency. Kindness looks like a trap until it proves otherwise through repetition. On the 5th day, Outlaw came to the fence. He stood at the near rail and put his nose over the top board, and she kept reading without looking up, and her voice did not change in pitch or pace. And he stood there for 11 minutes by her watch before moving back to the center of the enclosure. She wrote the time in a small notebook she had started keeping. On the 9th day, she changed her approach slightly. She came an hour earlier, before the full heat of the day, and she brought a bucket of alfalfa and a smaller bucket of clean water, and she set them inside the gate without entering the bay, and she went back to her chair and read. He did not touch the food while she was there. She left when the light went gold. In the morning, both buckets were empty. She noted that in the book too. By the 2nd week, she began to experiment with silence. She would stop reading mid-sentence and simply sit, letting the quiet fill up between them, and she watched how he responded. He did not escalate during silence. He became, if anything, more curious. His head would lift, his ears would track toward her, and once she saw his nostril flare in a long, slow inhale, as if he were trying to read her stillness. Kiara had worked with a man once, a Navy veteran with severe PTSD who had come to her practice in Carson City, who had told her that the worst thing about the first months of his recovery was that everyone's kindness felt like obligation, like they were waiting for him to reward them for being gentle. What had finally reached him, he said, was a physical therapist who simply did the work without needing anything back from him, who was consistent without being expectant. She thought about that man every day she sat in that chair. On the 14th day, she stood up, folded the chair, set it against the outside fence post, and walked to the gate. She unlatched it and pulled it open and stepped inside with nothing in her hands, and she stood there. The effect was immediate. Outlaw moved, fast, faster than anything that large should be able to move. And he came at her from the far end of the bay with his neck low and his ears flat, and the sound of his hooves on the hardpan was like a series of small explosions. 2 riders had described this charge in the incident reports. One had vaulted the fence. The other had not had time. Kiara did not move. She stood with her feet shoulder-width apart and her hands open at her sides, and she breathed out slowly through her nose. And she let her body go loose in the way that she had learned long ago was the single most difficult physical instruction to follow under genuine threat. She released the tension in her shoulders and her jaw and the base of her spine, and she looked not at his eyes but at the middle distance just above his withers. Because direct eye contact was dominance behavior, and she was not here to dominate anything. He stopped, not gradually. He stopped the way a stopped thing stops, completely, and with all of the energy of that charge suddenly reorganized into something else. His breath was loud and ragged against the silence of the afternoon. The tips of his nostrils were perhaps 8 inches from her face. She could feel the warmth radiating off his face. She did not move. He stood there for what felt like a very long time. His breathing slowed, not to calm. He was still churned with adrenaline, still processing the fact that she had not done what everything in his experience had taught him to expect, but it slowed from a roar to something more like a river. She brought her right hand up slowly, palm down, just below his nose, and she waited. He breathed onto her hand. She stood there in the middle of that reinforced bay with an animal that had killed a man, and she felt something move in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite hope, but some mineral combination of the two. And she thought, "You are not a monster. You are a terrified thing in a world that has been terrible to you." And she thought, without knowing why, "You know something." She came to him every morning after that. The progression was not linear. There were days when he was distant again, when some sound from the road or some shift in the wind sent him back to the far wall, and the flat ears and the warning posture. And on those days she simply sat in the chair outside and read until the light failed. She had learned to read his withdrawals as information rather than rejection. Something had happened on those days. Something had reminded him. She began to catalog the triggers. A truck with a loud exhaust backfiring on the county road. The particular mechanical clatter of the hay baler running in the north field. Diesel fumes. The color blue, though that one took her longer to confirm. She wore a blue barn jacket one morning, and he shied hard when she came through the gate, and she went back and changed to gray, and he settled. Blue. She filed that away and did not yet understand why it mattered. 3 weeks after her first entry into the bay, she was able to work alongside him without a halter, moving through the space, shifting straw, filling the water trough, and he would monitor her with one ear and continue about the business of being a horse. On the 23rd day, she picked up his left front hoof. He let her. She had brought the proper tools from the tack room, and she worked carefully and without hurry, cleaning out the packed dirt and old bedding from around the frog of each hoof in turn. His breathing never spiked above resting rate. She worked her way around to the right rear, the last hoof, the one most horses were sensitive about, and she cleaned it the same way, slowly, and when she set it down she leaned her forehead briefly against his flank and felt the warmth of him against her skin. It was during the second round of hoof cleaning, for days later, that she found it. She had removed the old iron shoes. They were overdue for replacement, and the farrier she had been meaning to call hadn't made it out yet, and she was cleaning the underside of his left rear hoof with a pick and a stiff brush. The packed material came away in layers, the accumulated months of a horse that no one had properly maintained, and when the last of it cleared from around the white line, she saw something dark and non-organic embedded along the inner edge of the hoof wall. She leaned closer. It was a residue, thin, almost waxy, compressed into the groove where the shoe had sat. A dark blue, not the gray-brown of dried mud, not the reddish clay of the local soil. A specific, manufactured blue. Industrial. The kind of blue that belonged to paint. She used a clean rag and removed what she could and held it in the light. Her hands stopped moving. Automotive paint. She knew this color. She had stood in front of it in the police impound lot when the officer had walked her through the scene inventory 3 days after Daniel's death. The tractor, a 1998 John Deere, family green, had been found on its side on the eastern slope with crushed damage to the cab consistent with a rollover. The officer had pointed out the scrape marks on the tractor's rear chassis. He had described them as likely contact with a fence post during the rollover. The scrape marks on the rear chassis of Daniel's tractor were that same dark blue. The police had noted them. She had asked about them. The officer told her that the paint transfer could have come from anywhere: a gate, a piece of equipment, an older vehicle Daniel had backed the tractor into at some point. It was not evidence of anything, he said, because there was no evidence of anything. The case was operator error on a slope at night. Kiara sat back on her heels in the straw of the bay and looked at Outlaw. He was watching her. Not the tense, wide-eyed watch of a threatened animal. Something quieter. Something almost deliberate. She thought about what she knew. Outlaw's Bay was on the south end of the property, but the eastern slope, where Daniel had died, was visible from the bay's rear fence line. The property records showed Daniel had installed a run-out fence connecting the bay to the eastern pasture. Outlaw would have had line of sight to the slope on a clear night. The police report said the accident occurred at 11:40. The ranch hand who found Daniel at first light had also reported, in a footnote that Kiara had read and reread, that Outlaw had been loose near the eastern fence line the following morning. He had assumed the horse had broken out during the night. He had not broken out. He had been there. Outlaw had been on the eastern slope when Daniel died. The blue paint under his hoof, embedded deep, the way paint transfers when a hoof makes forceful, repeated contact with a painted surface, meant that Outlaw had kicked a vehicle. A dark blue vehicle, hard enough and often enough to leave material behind. Kiara stood up slowly. Her legs felt strange. She put one hand on the horse's neck and stood there until the feeling passed. Someone had been on that slope in a dark blue vehicle the night Daniel died. An outlaw had attacked it. The tractor's marks were not from a fence post. She looked at the horse's dark eyes for a long time. He did not look away. She whispered, "What did you see?" She told Gerald. She drove to his office in Elko the following morning with the paint residue in a sealed plastic bag and the photographs she had taken of the hoof and the tractor's chassis markings. She had pulled those from her own phone. Pictures she had taken at the impound yard out of a grief-blurred instinct she had not understood at the time. Gerald looked at everything on his desk for a long time. He was not a dramatic man. He did not make speeches. He looked at the photographs and he looked at the residue and he folded his hands and he said, "I always thought something was wrong with that report." He told her what he knew about Brantley Walsh. Brantley had been trying to acquire Black Ridge property for 3 years. He ran a livestock operation 12 miles east, cutting horses for the rodeo circuit, which meant horses trained to cut cattle from a herd and which commanded serious competition fees. He was also, as far as Gerald had been able to observe, deeply invested in the state rodeo betting circuit, not officially, not in any way a regulator would find on paper, but in the way that men who own horses and move money through livestock operations can be invested without a paper trail. Daniel had been going to the county commissioners. Kiara looked up. Gerald said it carefully. 6 weeks before he died, Daniel had requested a meeting with the county agriculture commissioner's office. He had not told Gerald the full substance of it, but he had said enough. He had witnessed something at the Walsh livestock facility during a fence line dispute. Something about the horses, the way they behaved in the holding pens before competition events. Kiara asked him to say it plainly. Gerald said, "I believe Daniel saw evidence that Brantley was chemically stimulating his horses before rodeo events. Substances that cause pain and agitation, that make the animals jump higher and react more violently. The scoring in bucking competitions is partly based on the horse's intensity. A horse in pain behaves like a horse that is genuinely feral. Judges cannot always tell the difference. Bettors who know which horses have been treated can wager accordingly." She stared at him. Gerald said, "It is a known form of fraud in the circuit. It has been prosecuted elsewhere. If Daniel had documentation and was prepared to bring it to the commissioners, it would have ended Brantley's operation entirely and likely triggered a criminal investigation." She said, "So Brantley knew." Gerald nodded slowly. She said, "And Brantley knew about Outlaw." He knew that Daniel had acquired a horse from the Elko auction, a horse that had been at Walsh Livestock before Daniel bought him, a horse that would have recognized Brantley, that would have reacted to him. She said, that is why Brantley called him a machine of death. That is why he wanted him removed as part of the property deal. Not because the horse was a liability, because the horse was a witness. Gerald sat very still. She told him about the blue paint. She told him that Brantley Walsh drove a dark blue GMC Sierra that was known throughout the county because it was fitted with custom chrome work and a lift kit, and had been the subject of a brief but spirited debate on the local community board about road clearance violations. She told him that Outlaw's reaction to the color blue was extreme and consistent and had the quality of conditioned terror rather than generalized sensitivity. Gerald asked her what she wanted to do. She told him she needed two things. She needed confirmation of the vehicle repair, specifically whether Brantley's truck had been taken in for bodywork in the weeks following Daniel's death, and she needed to enter the championship. Gerald looked at her for a moment and then picked up his phone. The body shop confirmation took 4 days and cost Gerald a conversation with a mechanic named Reese who had done work for the Walsh operation and had been sitting with something uncomfortable for months. Reese said the truck had come in with lateral panel damage on the passenger side and a cracked running board. He said Brantley had told him it was a deer strike. He said the damage pattern had not looked like any deer strike he had ever seen. It had looked like repeated heavy impact from something roughly the height and force of a large horse's hind legs. Reese had not said anything at the time because he valued having a business in this county. He said he would now. Gerald filed a protective affidavit with the county clerk's office. He contacted a state investigator he had worked with on an agricultural fraud case 5 years prior. He told Kiara that this was moving in the right direction, but that it was moving through official channels, which meant it was moving slowly, and that Brantley would almost certainly hear something before any formal inquiry reached him. She said, then I need to move faster. She submitted her entry for the Nevada State Working Ranch Championship that afternoon. She listed Outlaw as her competition horse. 2 days later, Brantley Walsh came to the ranch. He did not come in through the kitchen this time. He came to the stable fence, and he watched her working with Outlaw in the outdoor ring, and his expression had changed completely from the first visit. The softness was gone. What was underneath it was harder and less considered. He told her she was making a mistake. He said the horse was dangerous and that she was going to get herself killed showing off in front of a crowd, and that the smart thing, the dignified thing, given her circumstances, was to take the offer and move on. She did not look at him while she worked. She said, "How is your truck, Brantley?" A long silence. He left without another word. That night, she slept with a lamp on. She had been expecting something. She had not known what form it would take. She found out at 2:17 in the morning when the dog, a heeler mix named Roscoe who slept in the tack room, started a sound that was not barking. It was something below barking, a sustained low-register alarm that cut through her sleep immediately because she had lived enough time on a ranch to know that a dog making that sound was not responding to a coyote or a possum. That sound meant humans. She was already standing when the second sound came, the reinforced bay gate, which she knew by feel and sound the way you know the specific creak of your own front door, swinging open on its frame. She pulled on boots without socks and took the flashlight from the nightstand and went out the back door without turning on any lights. She moved along the outer fence line in the dark, and she came around the corner of the stable block in time to see the tail lights of a vehicle moving fast down the access road. Not Brantley's truck, but a flatbed work truck she did not recognize, already too far to read the plates. 2 sets of boot prints led from the vehicle's last position to the bay gate and back. The gate was still open. Inside, Outlaw was moving. Not the charge and stop of a threatened animal. Something else. He was pacing, tight, obsessive circles near the water trough, his legs moving with a stiffness that was not his natural gait, and his breathing was wrong. Too fast, too shallow. His coat was wet along the neck and flank despite the cool night air, and when she got close enough, she could see the small puncture mark on the muscle group at the base of his neck. She did not need to see a syringe on the ground, though she found one half buried in the straw near the gate, to understand what had happened. Her stomach dropped. She had read enough about rodeo fraud in the preceding weeks to know the substances used. Capsaicin-based compounds were common. Oleoresin derived from concentrated chili extract, injected into the large muscle groups, causing intense burning pain that made the animal frantic without leaving obvious external marks. Some operations used more refined compounds, synthetic stimulants that accelerated the sympathetic nervous system and amplified the stress response. Either way, the animal suffered. Either way, the animal behaved like a monster. Either way, it looked like the animal was the problem. She knelt next to the water trough, and she put her hand flat on the ground, and she breathed. The championship was in 6 hours. She pulled out her phone and called the large animal veterinarian on record for the property, a woman named Dr. Paulette Rice, who had treated the breeding stock for years and who answered her phone on the third ring with the steady voice of someone accustomed to middle-of-the-night emergencies. Kiara described what she had found. Dr. Rice asked a series of questions: heart rate, gum color, pupil response, sweat distribution, and Kiara worked through them methodically, holding the flashlight in her teeth while she checked each indicator. Dr. Rice said the presentation was consistent with a stimulant injection, likely muscular rather than intravenous, which meant the compound was releasing more slowly. She said complete metabolic clearance in a horse of Outlaw size would take 12 to 16 hours minimum. She said she could come out, but that there was no antidote, only supportive care and time. Time they did not have. Kiara asked, "Is he in danger?" Dr. Rice paused. She said the compound alone would not kill him, but that a horse in this state put through intense physical and emotional stress, crowd noise, confined arena, unfamiliar smells, was at risk of a cardiovascular event. She said competing was not advisable from a medical standpoint. Kiara said she understood. She stayed in the bay for the rest of the night. She did not try to work with him or calm him through physical intervention. She knew that touching him while the compound was at peak intensity would be experienced as further threat, not comfort. Instead, she did what she had done from the beginning. She brought the chair. She sat outside the gate and she talked to him. Not from the field guide this time, not from the hardware catalog. She talked to him the way she had not talked to anyone since the funeral. She talked about Daniel. She told Outlaw about the morning Daniel had brought her to see the ranch for the first time, how she had stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and looked at the mountains in the early light and thought, this is where the hard and the beautiful decide to coexist. She talked about his hands, which were rough in the specific way that working hands get rough, and about the way he laughed with his whole face. She talked about the things she had not known, the second mortgage, the commissioner's meeting, the thing he had been trying to fix alone because he had always been trying to fix things alone, which was his best quality and his worst one at the same time. She talked until the sky went from black to gray to the particular pink that the desert does when it is deciding to be a new day. Outlaw's pacing slowed. He was not calm. The compound was still in him, and she could see the muscle tremors along his shoulders. But he had oriented toward her, his head over the top rail of the gate, and his breathing had found something closer to a rhythm. She stood up. She looked at him. She said, "I know you are hurting. I know you cannot tell me what that feels like, but I need you to trust me one more time." He watched her. She picked up the syringe from the straw, sealed it in the plastic bag she had used for the paint residue sample, and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she went inside and put on her competition clothes. The Nevada State Working Ranch Championship was held at the Churchill County Fairgrounds, 40 minutes from Black Ridge on a road that passed through 3 separate light changes and a rail crossing and felt, this morning, approximately 3 times longer than that. Kiara drove the trailer in silence. Behind her, through the thin wall of the cab, she could hear Outlaw moving. The trailer rocked intermittently. She kept both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road. Gerald was already at the grounds when she arrived, standing near the registration gate in his court suit. He looked at the trailer and then at her face and said nothing, which she appreciated. He handed her a paper cup of coffee that was already getting cold and told her the state investigator had been briefed and was present in the stands in civilian clothes. He said the investigator was not there to make an arrest. Not yet, not without due process, but that she should be aware of where he was sitting. He pointed out a section near the south entry. She nodded. She asked if Gerald had spotted Brantley. Gerald said, "North Camarote, center position." He got there early. She looked up at the Camarote Bank, the raised boxes along the north side reserved for property owners and sponsors, and she found him without difficulty. Brantley Walsh in a pressed shirt, sitting with 2 men she did not recognize, holding a coffee in one hand and looking at his phone with the focused ease of a man who already knew how his morning was going to go. He had not seen her yet. She went to the trailer and opened the rear gate and let Outlaw out into the holding pen adjacent to the warm-up arena. He came down the ramp with his ears up and his neck taut and the movement of a horse who was still internally on fire. But his eyes found her immediately, and she stepped in beside him and matched his pace for 30 seconds without touching him, just moving with him, and he slowed to match her. The warm-up arena was occupied by 3 other competitors, and every one of them stopped to watch when Outlaw came in. She had heard them talking by the water station earlier. There had been recognition, and something more cautious than respect. Outlaw's reputation had traveled. One of them, a lean man in his 40s who rode for a property north of Winnemucca, walked his horse over to the fence and told her with genuine directness that he hoped she knew what she was doing. She told him she did not entirely, but that she was committed to finding out. He looked at her for a moment and then nodded in a way that meant something more than acknowledgement. The main arena filled over the following hour. The Churchill County Fairgrounds could hold roughly 4,000, and the championship drew close to capacity on its final day. Ranchers, families, spectators who had followed the sport for years, youth competitors watching the main event from the rail. The announcer's voice rolled over the stands in that specific frequency that outdoor PA systems achieve in high desert air, equal parts clarity and slight distortion, and he ran through the morning's competitors with the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this for 2 decades. When he reached Outlaw's name, the crowd changed. Not loudly. It was a shift in register rather than volume, a collective intake, a murmur that moved through the sections like a pressure change before weather. A number of people turned to speak to their neighbors. A woman near the south rail put her hand on her husband's arm. Kiara heard the announcer describe the horse and then add, with evident discomfort, that the medical team had been briefed as a precautionary measure. She was standing at the gate to the main arena when the call came. She looked back one more time at Gerald. He was on his feet in the stands, hands in his jacket pockets, watching her with an expression she could not quite read from that distance. Behind him, 2 rows back, the civilian-clothed investigator had his phone out, but his eyes up. She opened the gate. Outlaw entered the arena. What happened in the next 30 seconds was the kind of thing that embedded itself into the memory of everyone present. The kind of scene that gets described at dinner tables in that county for years, always beginning with some variant of, "You have to understand what that horse looked like when he came out. He was enormous, and he was in pain, and he was terrified, and he was furious all at once. And the combination produced a creature that looked, to the 4,000 people watching, like something that should not exist in the same world as human beings." His hooves struck the packed dirt with the weight of something geological. The fence panels along the arena wall rang when he moved near them. His breath was visible in the morning air despite the heat. His eyes were wide and bloodshot and tracking everything. The crowd, the panels, the flags, the lights, with the hyper-alert scanning of a nervous system that had been chemically forced into a state of maximum threat response. The public address system crackled and the announcer said, with genuine urgency now, "Competitor, please be advised that your animal is displaying distress indicators. You are cleared to withdraw without penalty." Kiara walked through the gate. The crowd made a sound she had never heard before. Not quite a gasp, and not quite a cry. Something between admiration and the kind of dread that comes from watching someone choose the hardest possible thing. She walked to the center of the arena. Outlaw saw her and came. The charge was total. There was nothing held back in it, nothing hesitant, nothing that suggested the animal had any awareness of his own size or her fragility, and the sound of him coming at her across that arena floor was the loudest sound she had heard since the phone call that had woken her to tell her Daniel was gone. She had time, in the second or 2 before impact, for one complete thought, and the thought was this: either what I know about him is true, or it is not. She stopped at the center of the arena. She planted her feet. She closed her eyes. And she said his name, not loudly, not with effort, the way you say the name of something you love when you think it cannot hear you. And she brought her hands up in the position she had used every morning for 23 days. Palms down, fingers relaxed, below the level of his nose. He came at her like a wall, and he stopped. The crowd did not make a sound, for 1,000 people held the collective breath of a single organism. He was close enough that she could feel the heat of him on her face and the moisture of his expelled breath on her forearms. His front hooves had stopped 6 inches from her boots. His body was trembling, not with aggression, but with the violent internal effort of a nervous system fighting itself, the compound demanding one response, and something older and more specific demanding another. She opened her eyes. His were inches from hers. She said, very quietly, I know. I know it hurts. I know it was not your fault. None of it." She moved her right hand slowly toward the line of his jaw, and she made contact, and she felt the shuddering in the muscle beneath her palm, and she began to press in the specific rhythmic sequence she had used during every handling session. A slow, firm pressure at the pole, behind the ears, down the crest of the neck, and she felt, increment by increment, the terror in him begin to reorganize around something that was not chemistry, around memory, around the 14 mornings she had sat in the chair, around the voice that had asked nothing and given everything. He folded, not collapsed, folded, deliberately, the way a horse chooses to lie down when it chooses. His front legs bent first, then his haunches, and he went to the arena floor with the aching, controlled motion of an animal making a deliberate declaration, and the dust rose around him in a slow circle, and Kiara knelt with him, one hand on his neck, until he was fully down. Then she stood, and she put her left foot in the hollow of his shoulder, and she stepped across his back without a saddle, without a bridle, without anything between her and the horse except the weeks of trust they had built from the floor up. He rose. 1,600 pounds of traumatized animal came up off the ground with a human being on his back, and he stood still in the center of that arena with his ears forward and his breathing, still fast, still ragged from the compound, beginning the long and visible process of returning to something recognizable. The crowd had no framework for what it had just witnessed. What they produced was not applause. It came later, and it came big. But first there was a silence that had the quality of a group of people simultaneously reconsidering something they thought they understood. Then someone in the south stand started. And then it was not something that could be stopped. She did not let the applause fill up the space before she acted. She dismounted, asked for the arena microphone, and the head official, a gray-haired man named Calloway who had been running this championship for 19 years and had seen a great many things but not this, handed it over with the expression of someone who has decided that whatever is about to happen is above his level of jurisdiction. She spoke clearly, without drama, without performance. She described the events of the previous night, the truck on the access road, the open gate, the syringe, the puncture mark on Outlaw's neck. She reached into her jacket and held up the sealed bag with the syringe. She described what Dr. Rice had assessed over the phone. She said, "This was done to ensure that this horse would injure or kill me in this arena this morning. The same person who arranged this also arranged the death of my husband on the eastern slope of Black Ridge Ranch 62 days ago." The stands went very quiet. She said Brantley Walsh's name. She said she had paint residue evidence from Outlaw's hooves that matched the chassis damage on her husband's tractor. She said she had a signed statement from a mechanic named Reese who had repaired lateral panel damage on a dark blue GMC Sierra belonging to Brantley Walsh 3 weeks after her husband's death. She said she had documentation from her late husband's files she had found in a locked drawer in his desk after Gerald had advised her to look, showing that Daniel had been compiling a report on the chemical stimulation of Walsh livestock horses for the benefit of a state agricultural fraud inquiry. She looked up at the North Camera Road. Brantley Walsh was no longer sitting. He was standing, and the 2 men with him were standing, and one of them was already moving toward the Camera Road exit. The civilian-clothed investigator in the south stand was on his feet with his credentials in his hand and his phone to his ear. 2 uniformed Churchill County deputies who had been managing crowd flow near the arena entrance were already moving. Brantley made it approximately 30 meters from the Camera Road exit before he was stopped. The deputies did not need to use any physical force. They did not need to because when he turned and looked back at the arena, at the 4,000 people watching him, at the cameras from the regional sports broadcast that had been covering the championship and were now pointing at him, at the investigator holding out his credentials, at Kiara standing on the arena floor with a microphone and a sealed evidence bag, and the enormous black horse standing calm beside her in the morning light, something went out of him, something that had been holding his particular version of the world together. He went with them without a word. The inspection of his truck, parked in the property owner's vehicle section, a blue GMC Sierra with custom chrome and a lift kit, took 40 minutes. The deputies found the lateral panel and running board that had been replaced. The repair work consistent with Reese's statement. They found, in the locked compartment under the passenger seat, a case containing several small glass vials and a set of veterinary-grade syringes that the state investigator identified as consistent with the Rodeo stimulant compounds named in 3 open-circuit fraud investigations in Nevada and Utah. The investigator made 3 calls in rapid succession and then walked to the arena fence and stood there looking at Kiara for a moment before he said, "You should know that your husband's report is going to be the central document in this case." She said she knew. He said he was thorough. She looked at Outlaw, who was standing at her shoulder. She said, "Yes, he was." The head official, Calloway, came to her after the formal proceedings had moved outside the arena. He told her that competition precedent had no established protocol for what she had just done. He conferred with the panel of judges for 11 minutes. Then he came back and told her that based on the demonstrated horsemanship, the extraordinary circumstances, and the unanimous vote of the judging panel, they were awarding her the performance points for the championship round. She won the competition. The $100,000 was wired to an account Gerald had established for the Black Ridge property within 4 business days. The bank received the payment 14 days before the foreclosure deadline. Brantley Walsh was charged with second-degree homicide, criminal conspiracy, aggravated animal cruelty across multiple counts relating to the Rodeo fraud operation, and unlawful interference with a witness, the latter charge relating to the injection of Outlaw. He was held without bail pending a hearing that drew coverage from 3 Nevada news outlets and 1 agricultural industry publication that ran the story on its front page under the heading, "The Horse That Remembered." The first frost came to Black Ridge in late October, earlier than usual, and it arrived the way good things and hard things both arrive in that country, quietly, overnight, without announcement, and by morning it had already become simply the way things were. Kiara stood on the porch with her coffee and watched it. The Black Ridge property looked different in the frost light. The angles of the fence lines were sharper. The stable block had a settled quality, a sense of purpose inhabiting it from the inside out, and the new signage, hand-cut by a carpenter from Elko whom a woman at the county fair had recommended, read, "Black Ridge Rehabilitation Center for Working Animals. EST in the memory of Daniel Voss." They had incorporated as a nonprofit in September. Gerald had handled the paperwork with the focused efficiency of a man who had been waiting for something useful to do with his legal skills for several years. The state veterinary board had sent a liaison. 2 universities with equine science programs had requested a formal collaboration agreement, which was still being negotiated with the careful attention to detail that Gerald brought to everything. There were 7 horses at the center now. 6 had come from documented abuse situations in the Rodeo circuit, 3 from the Walsh operation, 3 from a separate facility in Utah that had been swept up in the wider investigation that Brantley's arrest had triggered. The 7th was a quarter-horse mare named August that a teenager from a neighboring property had brought by on a Saturday morning with a handwritten note explaining that she had stopped eating after a transport trauma and none of the usual approaches were working. Kiara had worked with August for 2 weeks using the same protocol she had developed with Outlaw. The mare was now eating regularly and had been seen by her young owner showing interest in other horses through the fence line, which Dr. Rice said was a reliable indicator of emotional return. The teenager had cried when told. Gerald had suggested, with characteristic understatement, that they should formalize the intake protocol into a training curriculum. He had identified 3 equine behavior specialists at universities in Reno and Flagstaff who had expressed interest in reviewing her methodology. He had also, without being asked, compiled a brief for the state legislature's Agriculture Committee describing the gaps in current animal welfare enforcement that had allowed the Walsh operation to function for as long as it had. He came out to the ranch every Thursday now. He had stopped billing for his hours in October and had begun referring to himself, when anyone asked, as the Foundation's general counsel. Kiara had not made a formal offer and he had not asked for one, and both of them understood that some arrangements are stronger when they are not made too explicit. The trial date had been set for the following spring. The district attorney's office had told Kiara she would be called as a witness, but that the physical evidence was strong enough that the outcome was not dependent on her testimony alone. She was relieved by this, not because she feared the stand, but because she had discovered that there is a particular exhaustion that follows the long-sustained effort of carrying something terrible, and she was learning the slow and uneven work of setting it down. She thought about Daniel differently now, not with less pain, but with less of the particular anguish that comes from not understanding. She had read the files he had kept in the locked desk drawer, the notes from the commissioner meeting, the photographs he had taken at the Walsh facility, the draft report he had been assembling with the careful and slightly formal prose of a man who did not fully trust his own anger and was trying to translate it into something a bureaucracy could use. She had read it all, and she had understood, at the end of it, who her husband had been. Someone who believed that the quiet and documented truth was more durable than the loud and personal one. She believed he had been right. She had sent copies of everything to the reporter from the agricultural industry publication, and the story had run, and a second outlet had followed, and the Walsh prosecution had become something that people in the circuit talked about in the way that people talk about things that they had suspected for years without a language to name. Kiara had provided the language. It had cost her more than she had had, and she had paid it anyway. The day she took the photograph, the one that Gerald printed and hung in the center's front office without asking her permission, which she decided to forgive, was a still morning in early November when the light came in at a low angle from the east and turned everything it touched the color of old copper. She was at the arena fence. Not working, not training, just standing. Outlaw came from the far pasture at a walk. He had not been led or called. He had simply decided to come, the way horses do when they have made a decision about something, with the unhurried certainty of a large animal that has nothing to prove. He stopped beside her and put his nose to the fence rail, and she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. And they stayed like that for a moment that had no particular duration, only presence. The desert stretched out behind them, the red mountains, the alkali flats, the sky so wide and indifferent and beautiful that it makes human trouble feel both very small and very important at the same time, which is the specific emotional condition of living in that country. And the narrator returns, quiet now, final. The most dangerous horse in the world had been carrying an unbearable truth in the only language he had. He had been raging and charging and screaming it in the only way a creature can scream when no one has learned to listen. And then someone sat down outside his fence with a folding chair and a field guide and 2 empty hands and decided to hear him. If you believe that listening is its own kind of courage, that sometimes the bravest thing is to be still enough to understand something that everyone else has written off, then leave that in the comments. Hit like, subscribe to this channel, and tell us, what is your city and what is the thing you are still trying to find the language to say? Because every honest story starts the same way. Someone stops, someone listens, and something that had been locked a very long time finally gets to be free.